Welcome everyone to our Zoe office hours designed to focus on Zoe V3 for Zoe users. I'm Rose Sakat. I'm the Zoe onboarding squad lead, and I'll be kicking off the session, and I'll be handing it over to Sean Grady, the squad lead for our App Framework Web UI squad. And he'll be focusing in on the application framework. Just a little bit of background before we get started. If you are a Zoe extender and you missed the office hours series focused on Zoe V3 and the impact to extenders, please visit zoe.org/vnext. There's a page there that's dedicated to V3, and that's where you'll find the recordings for that series dedicated to extenders. This series, however, will focus on specific Zoe components, all the components that you see listed here, to ensure that we offer all of the Zoe consumers, and by that we mean installers, admins, users. We want to offer them a deeper understanding of V3 in general. And just as a reminder, office hours are meant to be interactive, so please ask questions, raise concerns, and offer comments. You can do that in the chat along the way, and we'll take some time after Sean concludes the presentation to respond to those chat questions. In the event that we're not able to get to them, we will post the Q&A at that same site from zoe.org, that vNext page, and we'll continue to keep you posted with anything else that's happening with respect to V3. Let's see. What we usually do here for every component that we focus in on for the V3 consumer office hours, we start with a general overview and timeline of what's happening with the Zoe releases. And then we'll go into detail on specifically overview of features related to V3 and the particular component that we're focused in on, which will be the Web UI app framework. And then we'll talk about installation and configuration changes for that component as it relates to V3. Similarly, if there's any change to the user experience, Sean will go into detail on that, and then dive a little deeper into any new features that will be delivered as a result of, with V3 that are planned for V3. And finally, we'll conclude with general information on where you can find, more details. You'll reference the site where we store the recordings and the PowerPoint, and hopefully anything else that you may need related to V3. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So let's get started with the Zoe release information. We want to make you aware of several dates. The first is when we expect to deliver V3. That date is set for March 28th, so just less than 2 months away. And then make you aware of the fact that the V1 release, which has been in maintenance mode for quite some time, several years now, will end support with the community at the end of September. That's September 30th, 2024. And if you're interested in wondering, should I upgrade to V2? What's my runway for maintenance for V2 when V1 ends support? Plenty of time for that. That termination of support is out at Q3 of 2026, approximately end of August. We haven't finalized that date, but it'll be around that time. So for those of you looking to upgrade and you have conformant extensions that you leverage, the compatibility recommendations that we offer you is to first verify your extension has earned V3 conformance if you're interested in upgrading to V3. Similarly, if you're planning to go to V2. If in fact you are not seeing the conformance badge at the OMP landscape for Zoe conformance, please verify with your vendors, with the vendor that produced that extension, and confirm that your extension is operable with the release that you choose to upgrade to. And just a note here that we list at the bottom, those of you who are paying for support from various vendors and the vendors that have earned conformance from the Zoe Support Provider Conformance Program, they too must reapply for conformance at V3, and they, as a comprehensive support provider, they will need to ensure that they will continue to support existing core components, but also any new core components that are introduced in V3. And we do have 2 new core components that will be introduced. They are the Zoe Explorer for IntelliJ plugin, as well as the Zoe Client SDK Node.js. Okay, next slide, Sean. And similarly, just wanted to lay out in a timeline what it looks like as far as where we're at today. We're in February. Welcome to February. We're delivering our live office hours. There are pre-releases of V3 available. That information is on our vNext page. As we move towards March, we'll be transitioning V2, the final active release for V2. So final package of enhancements, new capabilities, et cetera, will be delivered in early March for V2. And then at the end of March, we'll introduce V3. Come May, V2 will start to introduce maintenance releases. It will transition, we use the term active to maintenance. And then finally, September 30th, as I mentioned, that is the final release and the termination of community support for Zoe V1. And I think that's it for me. So I will turn it over to you, Sean, to talk about the web UI in Zoe V3.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Rose. So I think this actually is going to be a short one, and I see that as a positive thing. But the short story is that every time we make a major release like V1, V2, V3, it's an opportunity for the community to make changes that they couldn't otherwise make during a normal release cycle, like going from 2.9 to 2.10. And that might mean some changes to the way that you interact with Zoe. It might mean some deprecation or removal of APIs or something like that. So these could be either disruptive changes or breaking changes that could occur on this boundary. But I'm happy to say that I don't think you'll be seeing such changes with the app server, desktop, or otherwise app framework of the V3 release. And this is because I think we set ourselves up well in V2 such that we don't need to make drastic changes to improve. We can make iterative changes that are non-disruptive over the course of standard releases. And we had done that in V2. So there were some significant changes in V2, but they came in a relatively non-disruptive manner. And so I think that's going to continue to be the case in V3 for the app framework. But here are the biggest highlights that I can talk to you about today. The first thing that we have already completed is adding Webpack 5 as a possible way to build your apps into the desktop. The desktop itself now uses Webpack 5. But I'll explain on the next slide why that isn't such a big deal. Shouldn't really be a breaking change to you. The next one on the list, Angular. Every time a major version of Zoe comes out, we want to upgrade Angular. Unfortunately, we have not been able to this time around. Maybe we'll get to it before release, but I find it doubtful. We encountered some difficulties with the newer versions of Angular regarding their rendering solution called Ivy, that the dynamic nature of the desktop was not designed for Ivy. It predates it, and trying to get the desktop to work with Ivy is still ongoing. So at this time, we're going to stay on Angular 12, and we'll revisit this for V4. But I don't foresee any issues with staying on Angular 12. So the good news is that it's non-disruptive. I have to check with the rest of the WebUI squad on if that means that we did the TypeScript upgrade or not. Angular itself wants newer versions of TypeScript, but I'm sure that we're free to upgrade to newer versions of TypeScript whenever, and they tend not to be disruptive. So I'll check on whether or not we did that, but I'm guessing maybe not. Um, the last thing on this bullet point here I wanted to mention, it's not entirely in the app framework. ZSS is standalone, but is often paired with the app framework. And so I just wanted to give a shout out that ZSS is changing its default configuration. In V2, ZSS had been shipped in binary format of both 31-bit and 64-bit, but it was defaulting to 31-bit. And the reason why it defaulted to 31-bit in V2 was because that is what people had built their plugins for. And, um, a data service of ZSS can only plug into one edition of ZSS. So we didn't, we decided not to be disruptive in V2 by switching to a 64-bit default, but we will in V3 because, the longer we sit on 31-bit, the more it can become an issue for users. So we want to get there sooner rather than later. So here's a little bit of info on Webpack. Like I said, there's no breaking change expected for Webpack, and that's because when we moved to Webpack 5, we didn't remove Webpack 4. It's still there. Basically, any app can use whatever implementation of Webpack they want as long as their app still shows up on the desktop and has proper isolation of things like CSS to prevent bleed out of styles or stuff like that. So, um, we've tested that Webpack 4 and Webpack 5 can exist side by side. And so this isn't really disruptive because what the app framework provides to you is an example or base configuration file for using Webpack. So you've always been able to choose not to use our example if you didn't want to or had some reason not to. And so this doesn't really change. The thing is that we're really just providing you with a new example of the newer Webpack version. So, this is only going to affect you if you choose to use it. We would recommend always using the newest version of Webpack, though, because from what we can tell, their support policy is always better on their newest version. So we wanted to add it for reasons of keeping current and keeping in their maintenance cycles. But Webpack 4 is still going to be there, so it's not really disruptive to anyone. The other thing that I wanted to dig into more is the ZSS 64-bit stuff because that could be disruptive. This is more on the ZOS squad. In the beginning of V2, ZSS was part of the WebUI squad, and then it broke off into a different squad, but we still kind of, cooperate with each other. And so I just put some info here. Um, the short story is that since ZSS data services are compiled C code, you need to compile it in either 31-bit or 64-bit, and ZSS cannot load a data service that is uh, not compiled for it. So um, when we move to the 64-bit default, that means that if you have a plugin which has an older ZSS data service that is compiled in 31-bit, it's not going to be able to load in 64-bit ZSS. However, 31-bit ZSS isn't being removed. It's just not going to be the default anymore. So in the short term, V3.0 comes out, you or your customers are going to use it, and suddenly you can't load one of your plugins anymore. Well, you can fix that. You just go into your configuration file, you find components.zss.agent.64-bit, and you set it to false instead of true. However, as time goes on, that's going to be less realistic because as more extenders ship 64-bit or maybe even 64-bit by default, well, you can only use one version of ZSS at a time. So if you have a bunch of plugins and some have 31-bit and some have 64-bit, then you're going to have a problem where you want them all to be 64 or all to be 31. And so this is why, you want as a developer, you want to go to 64-bit. As a user, you want to make sure that all of your extensions are 64-bit. Now, I just like to point out that in the app framework, not every plugin has a ZSS data service. In Zoe's base, only two of them do. So, you know, your mileage may vary on how much this affects you to begin with. But for the developers, I would like to point out that if you want to make your customers the happiest here, what you really want to do is ship two versions of your data service. In a plugin definition, you can state a parameter called library name to specify where your CSS data service is located. That's the way that it's been sent in V1, right? Now, what library name as a parameter does is whatever ZSS starts up, it tries to find the data service in the file name that you provided. Now, the problem is you don't know whether that's 31-bit or 64-bit. So we've created two new parameter names. There's one now called library name 31 and one called library name 64. So instead of just having a library name, which you can still have, but is ambiguous, you can now specify 31 and 64 so that you can have different file names for different versions and package both so that your plugin will work in both editions. I believe ZSS itself isn't significantly changing from V2 to V3. I would say its plugin API is changing not at all. So if you had a 31-bit version, that 31-bit version probably works perfectly well on V2, whereas the 64-bit version is going to be forward-looking for V3. So it may very well be the case that having both in your distributable would allow you to support both versions of Zoe. If you want examples of how you might handle that, I will jump over quickly to GitHub here. I'll make my font a lot bigger. Um, Here we go. So here's a plugin definition, sample Angular app. It's been around for a while. You can see this is actually version 2 that we're looking at. This parameter here, library name 31 and library name 64 that I mentioned, this has existed even during V2. So you've already been able to use this. It's nothing really new. But you can see here that I have a data service in my plugin, and it says type service. That means it's meant for ZSS. And library name 31 and 64 are saying, given the parent directory of this plugin definition file, go into the folder called lib. And in the folder called lib, I want to find whatever file name is specified here and load it. So you can see that we just have side by side storage 31 and storage 64. Now, the other half of this is how do we even build those? So if we go over to the build script folder here, what you'll see is that we have two of everything here. We have a build script for 31 and a build script for 64. And since ZSS exposes a plugin API, we have a .x file for declaring which functions we're using. So you can see here, it will just say import code ZSS server for 31-bit. And then for 64-bit, it'll say import code 64 ZSS server 64. And these are really the name of the binaries. So if you're looking within the Zoe runtime, even in V2, you can actually test this stuff in V2 right now if you want. You will find in the Zoe runtime the folder components /ZSS/bin. And in there, there's going to be two binaries, ZSS server and ZSS server 64. So they've been there the whole time. The only difference is that we're just changing the default. So what's the main difference between 31 and 64 in these build scripts? I think it's just the compilation flags, really. We're just using C89 here with nothing really special, but I think in 64 we use the LP64 flag. And well, that's about it. Most of the challenge will be within your code to make sure that your code is 64-bit compatible. So that's actually about it. Like I said, there's really nothing significant in terms of disruption for the app framework in V3. That's not to say that V3 won't have interesting new features. It's just that from the app framework perspective, V3 is just another release for us. We continue to make new features all the time. And so, to us, V3 is really just going to be V2.16 from our perspective. It's just another day. It's just another release for us to add new features. So, just expect more great things over the course of the entire V3 lifecycle. I spoke in a previous office hours about plans for the future. What other new features are we thinking of implementing? In the last meeting, I had actually said that coming in V3, the servers will start to standardize how you configure the IP address, the TLS levels, and the ciphers. And what do you know? It turns out we had enough of a runway that we just did it in V2 anyway. So that's what I'm really talking about, is that when something's non-disruptive, we don't need to wait for V3 to do it. We'll just do it at any time. So in the latest edition of V2, for example, you'll find that new feature that I mentioned. It's called Network. So this is a sort of continuation from the last office hours on the subject, but we added a section called Zoe.network, and you can find out more about it in our release notes, but you can use the Zoe config file to easily say, what is my min or max TLS, what is the list of ciphers that I want to use, and what is the IP address that I'm going to bind to. And we're going to better position that over the course of V3 for improving our IPv6 support and also to make ATTLS easier to configure. So we're not completely done with this whole network configuration thing, but I'm just pointing out that last office hours meeting I said, this will be coming by V3. And the point is that actually some of it has already been implemented. So you can look forward to more of that. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the next office hours meeting. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, we said that next week there's going to be an office hours on systems, install, and packaging. And I hope to contribute some knowledge there too. But I hope that that'll be an interesting one because we've been working on some cool things that we think will be really interesting right at 3.0. We've been working on an installer called Zen, which provides a graphical wizard for installing the Zoe servers. And we've been doing an overhaul of how much JCL we have and how it is organized because, a lot of the feedback that we've been getting over the course of Zoe is to, make the install and config experience closer to how sysadmins work with other products. And, we've really been taking that feedback to heart, and that's been a lot of the development effort over the past year. So I hope to give you even more cool info on the systems install and packaging topic rather than the app framework one. So just to conclude the info on these pages, if you want to speak more to the app framework group, you can find us on the Zoe app framework Slack channel of the OMP Slack. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, I don't use it. So if you see some other Sean Grady, I'm sure there's a lot of Sean Grady's out there. It's not me. But you can always find me at sgrady@rocketsoftware.com or right after this meeting in a half hour is the App Framework's weekly community call. So you can always find me there as well. And well, I'll ask, are there any questions about the stuff that I presented or really any questions at all?
Hey, hey, Sean, this is Bruce. Excuse me. Can you give a few more words on staying on Angular 12? Is getting to 16 something that you could imagine being non-disruptive and maybe doing later in version 3? Or just give me a few more words, please.
Sure. So the reason why we upgrade Angular is to get new features and to keep our dependencies up to date. Now, in terms of support, in terms of keeping our dependencies up to date, it turns out that even if we were on the newest version of Angular when Zoe releases, Angular's support cadence is yearly, and Zoe's support cadence is, we will support a version of Zoe for 4 years. So we're always going to be behind in some respect just because we support you longer than Angular does. But when it comes to a version boundary, we want to get as close as we can, right? And so we wanted to go to 16 since 16 is the newest. It just turns out that when we're on 12, going even from 12 to 13 presents a challenge because they removed the rendering method that we used to do the dynamic loading in the desktop. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't upgrade. It just means that we need to do more research and bring in more experts to figure out how that's done. So it didn't align with our schedule, right? Because we thought it was going to be just another upgrade, and then it turned out that no, we have to invest a lot more time in this, and so it's just we need to plan better for that. So the problem with upgrading Angular, the reason why we only do it on a major version boundary is that um, anytime you update a library that is loaded by the desktop itself, the desktop is the parent of the entire web page. So anything that's not in an iframe can be influenced by what is in the base of the desktop. So if you're in an iframe, you're safe. Iframes are technically just other websites, more or less, presented in the same visualization. And our iframe support has gotten pretty good over the years, such that I would recommend it to new developers because it isolates you from any desktop changes, really. Um, and if you're in an iframe, you can go ahead and use Angular 16 right now. But the desktop itself, if I wanted to upgrade the desktop from Angular 12 to Angular 16, let's say we figured out a way to handle that Ivy migration. Well, it turns out that every non-iframe app would also need to do that Ivy migration. And so we can't just upgrade Angular versions mid-release cycle because it will just break apps. They won't load unless they're iframes. So that's why we do it on version boundaries. And so we're just going to have to revisit this in V4 and be better prepared at that time.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation.
Yep. But yeah, I guess the short story is I don't foresee any issues with this. It's just always nice to be current. Any other questions? All right then. Rose, I will hand it back to you if there's anything else you want to wrap up with.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, I just wanted to mention, since you're on this slide, that we encourage
Oops.
everyone to join our mailing list, Zoe-user at Open Mainframe Project. There's a link directly to that mailing list right from the zoe.org landing page in the announcements. At the very, very top, there's a link to join our mailing list. We encourage you to do this because it gives us an opportunity to reach out directly to you instead of asking you to come to us to get information that we feel may be relevant. We try to minimize what we send out, so we don't want you to feel as though you're getting an overabundance of mail from us, but we do leverage that to make you aware of items such as when critical technology has been replaced. And that's the example that we have here for Zoe CLI extenders when we replaced our Keytar technology due to vulnerabilities, or I shouldn't say that, due to an archival of the project that would no longer be supported and scanned, and as well as information related to releases and end of support notices. So just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. And thank you, Sean, for preparing the materials, and thank everybody for joining. Again, if you've missed any of them or you have interest in reviewing a topic that we missed, please look for them on the vNext page at zoe.org, and please consider joining us next Friday and the Friday after that, where we'll wrap up all of the office hours and we'll give everyone an opportunity to ask anyone any questions. So we'll have a lot of SMEs on that final call. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week, hopefully. Have a great weekend.